Hi everyone, I'm Anne from Scye Patterns, and in this video I'll be showing you some simple tricks for setting in a regular sleeve. So we're not talking here about gathered sleeves. They are rather easy to sew. We're talking about regular sleeves in a woven fabric. The problem with these sleeves is that they are always bigger than the arm side. In this video I'll show you 3 simple tricks for putting them in without any effort. But first I'll explain why the sleeves are always bigger than the armhole. This has to do with the seam allowance. Imagine I would draw patterns for a dress for a 12-year-old girl. I would make sure that the edges of the arm side and the sleeves have the exact same length, 44 centimeters. This is about 17 inches and a quarter. Perfectly easy to sew. But then I add the seam allowance to the arm side. The edge of the seam of the arm side will get smaller because the arm side is hollow. It's like when you draw a circle inside of another circle, you'll get a smaller circle. I use the 1 centimeter seam allowance here, and instead of 44 centimeters, my edge is now 42 centimeters long. Or in inches, the 17¼ inch edge is now a 16½ inch edge. For the sleeve, however, the opposite happens. When you add seam allowance to the sleeve, it's like drawing a circle around another circle. You'll get a bigger circle. So instead of a 44 centimeter edge, the sleeve now has a 46 centimeter edge. Instead of having to sew together 2 edges which have the exact same length, we have to sew together a 16½ inch edge with an 18 inch edge. These numbers I'm citing are not just hypothetical, this is how I measured them in my software program. So that is why the sleeves are always bigger than the armhole. Now you may ask, why don't pattern designers just make the sleeves smaller so that they fit the arm side when the seam allowance is already included? Well, that is because then the sleeves would not be comfortable to wear. You need a certain amount of room to move your arm in a sleeve. So it's better to draw a sleeve which is bigger and then use the right sewing techniques to make it fit the armhole than to draw a sleeve which is smaller but not comfortable to wear. Now, as I said in the example I just showed, I use only a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You can probably guess what would happen if I would use a bigger seam allowance. If I use a 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, the difference between both edges becomes even bigger. It's 8½ centimeters now, or well over 3 inches. So this brings us to our first tip. Don't use a bigger seam allowance than is necessary. Sometimes it's a good idea to use a 1½ or 2 centimeter seam allowance. For instance, when you use a roughly woven fabric which frays easily. But in many cases you can do with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and make setting in a sleeve much easier. But even with a smaller seam allowance, there is still a difference between both edges, of course. So what are the classic ways of dealing with that problem? How I learned it in formal sewing school is like this. I was taught to pin the sleeve inside of the arm side, and then, as I was sewing very slowly, push the top layer, the sleeve that is, under my sewing foot with my seam ripper. It took a long time and it never actually worked. A second classic method is to put a gathering thread into the sleeve. The idea here is not to create gathers, however. So this is quite a difficult technique. You don't want to pull the gathering threads too tight, because then you'll get puckers in your sleeve. But if you don't pull the gathering threads tight enough, the problem of the sleeve being too big isn't solved either. And the reason that these two techniques don't work very well is that unless you have a dual feed on your machine will always be processing the lower layer of fabric faster than the upper layer. This is because the lower layer is actively pushed forward by the feed dogs in your machine, and the top layer is kind of dragged along. So as I'm demonstrating here, when I try to sew together 2 pieces which have the exact same length, the lower layer will be processed faster than the upper layer. So when we pin a sleeve into an armhole, the top layer will be the sleeve, which is already bigger than the arm side, and then on top of that, the arm side will also be processed faster. So while you are pushing the arm side fabric with your seam ripper or using a gathering thread in your sleeve, your machine is largely ruining your efforts by processing the arm side faster than the sleeve. So the solution to this problem kind of speaks for itself. Switch things around. When you're sewing your sleeve and armhole together, put the sleeve at the bottom so that That will be processed quicker. That is tip number 2. So instead of pinning the sleeve into the armhole, I always pin the armhole into the sleeve. By the way, as you can see, I already closed the underarm seam of my sleeve and the side seams of my dress, but you can also do it the other way around, of course. First sew your sleeve into your armhole and then close your underarm seam and side seam. The 3 tricks I'm discussing in this video apply to both situations. So I'm pinning my sleeve around my armhole and I'm distributing the extra fabric evenly. If I put the sleeve at the bottom when I sew them together, my sewing machine will process the sleeve faster than the armhole. For a sleeve of this size, the difference will be about 1/2 centimeter or roughly 1/4 of an inch. So by switching things around, instead of the situation getting 1/2 centimeter worse, it'll get 1/2 centimeter better. Of course, 1/2 centimeter isn't that much. As we saw a few minutes ago, the difference between the sleeve edge and the armhole edge is around 4 centimeters. So that's why I have a 3rd tip. And that tip is to gently pull back the top layer. Let me illustrate what I mean by that. I cut another 2 equally long strips of fabric. I'm putting them under my machine, but this time I'll be pulling back the top layer slightly, not stretching it like this. That's not the idea. Rather, the idea is to capitalize on the uneven way in which the 2 layers are processed by your machine. The machine is processing the lower layer faster than the top layer. By just slightly holding back the top layer, not stretching it, just keeping it back a bit, this effect gets maximized. So as you can see, instead of a 1/2 centimeter difference, we now have a difference of 2.5 centimeters, which is about an inch. This is enough to compensate for the 4 centimeter difference we measured earlier, because remember, the 4 centimeter difference is at the rounded edge of the fabric, not where we are sewing both pieces together. I'll prove it to you. I'm putting my dress under my machine with the sleeve at the bottom, of course. I'm going to backstitch first to remove the first pin. And then I'm going to take the layers between my thumb and index finger at the next pin. And so as I'm sewing, I'm slightly pulling back the layers at the next pin. I'm actually holding back only the top layer by doing this because the lower layer, the sleeve that is pinned loosely to the armhole because it's bigger, remember? So when I pull both layers at the pin, I'm actually only holding back the top layer because the lower layer is looser. By the way, I didn't use that many pins, as you may have noticed. You can add as many as you like. The technique is always the same. So I'm continuing like this, just always doing the same. Keeping both layers of fabric between my thumb and index finger at the next pin, pulling back slightly, then removing that pin, going on to the next pin, keeping the layers between my thumb and index finger, pulling back slightly as I sew, removing the pin, moving on to the next one, and so on and so on. Almost at the end. And I'm going to finish with a back stitch, of course. And let's take a look at the end result. The result is this, a perfectly set-in sleeve with no puckers, done in a quick and easy way. So if you would like to give these tricks a try, but you're still looking for a kid's pattern with a woven sleeve, you could try perhaps my Felice pattern, which also has some other sleeve options, or my Tinny pattern, which also includes a gathered sleeve, some fun color options, or my Ume pattern, which is a shirt dress with a lot of different options, or my Laura pattern, which includes, among other options, a chipao dress. You can find them all in my shop in 4 different languages, and in a paper and a digital version, straightgrain.com/shop. Thanks for watching.